The Silent Revenge. How one man exposed his wife's affair in a way you'll never expect. He found out about her betrayal, but instead of making conclusions, he decided to act in an unimaginable way. Barry wrote a book in which he described every moment of pain, jealousy, and broken trust. He kept track of every step she took, but what he did next will shock you. What happened when his wife found out the whole truth through the book he wrote? Was it her last chance for forgiveness, or the beginning of the end of their marriage? She couldn't even imagine that her betrayal would end up in the pages of this book. Barry gave her no chance for excuses, and now everything will be decided. How will she react to the fact that he knew more than she thought? Barry stared at the blank page on his computer screen. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, and he felt the weight of yet another creative failure pressing against his chest. It had been 2 months since he sent the draft of his new novel to the publisher, and still no response. With each passing day, he felt as if the words that once flowed like a river had now frozen solid. Laughter echoed from the kitchen. Barry lifted his head and heard Caitlin talking to someone on the phone. He walked closer, holding a cup of coffee in his hands. "Yes, this seminar was absolutely fantastic," she said, her voice full of excitement. "I feel so inspired. I want to try something new." Barry smiled, watching her. Caitlin had been his muse and support throughout their years of marriage. But lately, she had changed. Her eyes sparkled when she spoke about her new hobbies and the fascinating people she met at seminars and workshops. Barry knew she was searching for herself, and he tried to support her in this. "What are you talking about?" he asked, stepping into the kitchen. "About a new course," she replied, turning to him with a smile. "It'll help me find my own path. You know, I can't spend my whole life just being a housewife." Her words left a strange feeling in his chest. She used to be so captivated by his writing, by the way he worked on every detail of his novels. But now it seemed her world had expanded while he remained in the same place. That evening, Caitlin packed her suitcase for another seminar. Barry sat in his office, trying to find words for a new chapter. But all he could think about were her words, "I want to find myself." The next morning was cold and silent. Caitlin left a note. "Barry, don't wait for me tonight. The seminar might run late. Love, Caitlin." She didn't return until after midnight. Barry sat by the window, watching as a taxi pulled up in the driveway. Caitlin stepped out of the car, laughing and talking to someone. The driver helped her with her suitcase. She hugged him briefly, and they exchanged a few words before the taxi drove away. Barry watched the scene unfold, and an uneasy feeling settled in his heart. Barry replayed what he saw the previous night. Caitlin's laughter, her hug with the stranger near the taxi. It all seemed so unlike her usual behavior. He tried to convince himself it was just a friendly gesture, but doubts had already taken root in his mind. When she woke up the next morning, Barry prepared breakfast and decided to talk. "How was the seminar?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Oh, it was amazing," Caitlin said, sitting at the table and spreading jam on her toast. "It was so inspiring. We talked about finding ourselves, about making our dreams come true." "Sounds interesting," Barry said, squinting slightly as he watched her. "Who was your speaker?" Caitlin paused for a moment, then smiled. "Jessica Vaughn. She specializes in coaching." Barry nodded, but something still didn't add up. If the seminar was so inspiring, why had she come home so late, so tired, and somehow distant from him? Why did her conversation with the taxi driver seem so familiar? He replayed the scene in his mind again. Caitlin got up from her chair, kissed Barry on the cheek, and went to the bathroom. His eyes involuntarily rested on her suitcase, which stood near the bedroom door. "No, I have no right," he thought, trying to stop himself. But what if there's something in there that explains her behavior? In the end, curiosity won. He walked over to the suitcase, unzipped it, and began carefully sifting through her belongings. It was mostly clothes and cosmetics, but a small black notebook caught his attention. Barry opened it. Inside were various notes about personal development, but a few pages made him suspicious. There were names of people with their contact information. One name stood out, Bruce 555-3489. Next to the name was a small heart emoji. Additionally, There was some elegant lingerie Caitlin had packed, something he had never seen her wear before. It puzzled him. Why would she need that? Who is Bruce? Barry thought, staring at the note. At that moment, Caitlin came out of the bathroom. He quickly closed the notebook and returned it to its place, trying to appear calm. "Were you looking for something?" she asked, noticing him standing near the suitcase. "I was trying to find a phone charger," he replied, trying to sound casual. "I couldn't find mine." "Your charger is always on the table." Caitlin frowned slightly, but then waved her hand dismissively. "You lose things so often." Barry nodded and left the room to avoid further questions. All day, he couldn't get the name Bruce out of his head. Who was he? And why was there a heart next to his name? Maybe he was just a friend or an acquaintance from the seminar? That evening, while Caitlin was busy preparing dinner, Barry opened his laptop in the study and started searching the number through various online services. He was surprised to find that the number was registered to someone named Bruce Kinwell, but he couldn't find any additional information. When Caitlin called him to the table, he acted as though nothing had happened. "How was your day?" she asked, scooping pasta onto his plate. "Interesting," Barry smiled. "And yours? You seem so energetic lately." "I just feel more alive," she replied, her eyes lighting up. "You should try something new too. Maybe sign up for a writing workshop." Barry nodded, but his mind was already forming a plan. He decided to find out who Bruce was and what role he played in Caitlin's life. That night, when Caitlin fell asleep, Barry took her phone and scrolled through her contacts. Bruce was there. He opened the chat, but the messages had been deleted. The only trace left was a few photos of what looked like a cozy cafe, perhaps a place she visited during the seminar. In one of the photos, a faint silhouette of a man could be seen in a mirror. Barry decided not to jump to conclusions. He returned the phone to its place and tried to convince himself that Bruce could simply be a friend, a colleague, or an acquaintance from the seminar. But the next morning, as Caitlin was getting ready for another meeting, her smile seemed a little too mysterious. "Where to this time?" he asked. "Oh, just meeting some new friends from the course," she replied without looking at him. "And Bruce will be there?" Barry said casually, watching her reaction. Caitlin paused for a moment, her eyes darting. But then she quickly regained her composure and calmly replied, "Of course. He's one of the participants, like me. Why do you ask? Do you know him?" "No, just curious," Barry forced a smile. When the door closed behind Caitlin, he realized that she used to share everything with him and had no secrets. But now, it seemed she was hiding something. Barry couldn't figure out what was happening to Caitlin. Just a few months ago, she had been a devoted housewife, happily making breakfast and lunch, helping him with chores, and spending evenings together discussing their plans for the future. But recently, everything had changed. Caitlin had become cold, distant, and, at times, even indifferent. She constantly talked about new training sessions, seminars, and courses she was attending. Her life now revolved around self-improvement and career building. Barry watched her with a growing sense that something was wrong. If she once happily cooked for him and managed the house despite her busy schedule, now she seemed completely uninterested in household tasks. When he asked her about it, Caitlin always replied, "I'm just going through a transformation. I want to become the best version of myself." She said it with such enthusiasm that Barry couldn't even argue with her. One evening, he came home after a long day at work and immediately sensed something was off. Caitlin was home, but instead of greeting him as usual, she sat on the couch, engrossed in her phone. "Hi," Barry said, taking off his shoes. "What's new?" "Hi," Caitlin replied without looking up. "I just finished a time management video lesson. It's important for my career." Barry sighed, trying not to dwell on her indifference. He went to the kitchen, hoping that at least today she had made dinner. But the kitchen was empty, just a few unwashed plates that had been sitting there for days. "Caitlin, why didn't you make anything for dinner?" Barry asked, his voice calm, but disappointment evident in his eyes. "I'm just so tired, Barry," she replied without looking up. "You have no idea how much I need to learn." Barry felt his heart tighten again. She was absorbed in herself, and he felt like an outsider in their relationship. Only recently, he had noticed how Caitlin started treating him as if he were unnecessary. The connection they once shared was gone. The evening passed in silence. Barry sat in the living room, jotting down notes for a novel he had begun writing in recent weeks. The idea came to him after he started noticing changes in Caitlin. He decided it would be a way to process his sadness and disappointment. He planned to write a story about their relationship, but with his perspective added, something he hoped to gift her as a surprise someday. He hoped that, by reading his thoughts, she would understand his pain and begin to change. Occasionally, Barry would put down his work and glance at Caitlin. She sat staring at her phone, responding to messages, always looking like she was hiding something. "Caitlin, who is this?" Barry asked one day, seeing Bruce's name on her phone. He wanted to gauge her reaction. She quickly placed the phone on the table, as if reacting to some sudden suspicion. "Just one of the participants from the course. I think I've already told you about Bruce. It's nothing important." Barry couldn't hide his disappointment. Lately, her behavior had been growing increasingly strange. He couldn't understand why she had changed so much. Perhaps it was just her worries about her career, but he felt there was something more to it. The next day, Caitlin went to another of her training sessions. Barry felt that this was the last straw. She wasn't telling him anything. So, he decided to check her laptop and see what was really going on. He didn't find anything incriminating, but something in her demeanor and attitude toward him still didn't sit right. That evening, Caitlin came home late. Barry decided it was time to talk to her. "Caitlin, we need to talk," he said as she walked through the door. She looked up, her eyes momentarily confused. "What do you want to talk about?" Barry took a deep breath, feeling his heart tighten, and continued. "What happened to us? I don't understand why you've changed. You don't care about me anymore, about us. You're always so focused on your career." Caitlin was silent for a moment, then tears filled her eyes. "Barry, I'm trying to find myself. I don't know who I am without this. I'm tired of just sitting at home, cooking and cleaning. I want more. I want to do something meaningful and exciting for other people." Barry couldn't believe these words were coming from his wife. He understood that something big was happening, but he couldn't grasp what it was. Caitlin stepped closer to him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, almost in a whisper, "I don't know how you'll take this, but I love you, Barry. I know I've changed, but I genuinely want to find my place in life. It's not what you think." Barry felt his heart constrict at her words. His intuition told him that there was still more left unsaid. He decided to wait. He needed to learn more before drawing any conclusions. Barry woke up early, and even before breakfast, his heart was already racing with anxiety. He felt that something was shifting in their relationship, but it was all still so confusing. What had happened to Caitlin? Where had the woman he once knew gone? His thoughts kept circling back to one question. Was this just her pursuit of growth, or was it something more serious? Recently, Barry began noticing that the expenses for her training sessions had skyrocketed. At first, it seemed normal. Caitlin had always been eager to achieve more and improve herself. But the more he learned about these training sessions, the more bewildered he became. Caitlin seemed willing to spend enormous amounts of money on these courses. Barry had no idea how much they cost until he accidentally stumbled upon a bank statement. $20,000 for one course? He thought, scrolling through the transactions on his phone. It was an enormous amount, especially since he had been saving money for retirement. His face turned pale as he saw several other large sums transferred to various training companies. He knew Caitlin always used his money, but now it seemed excessive. Was she living off him in the literal sense? Barry didn't immediately decide how to react. He pulled himself together and went to work, delaying the moment of confrontation with Caitlin, even though he knew the issue couldn't be postponed. However, the more he thought about the situation, the clearer it became that this story had much deeper roots. Later that day, when Barry returned home, Caitlin was in her room again with her laptop. He overheard her enthusiastically discussing a new course with another coach via video call. She always talks like this, Barry thought. She had been the same way when she first started these courses, but now every conversation seemed overly enthusiastic. And most importantly, she never mentioned how much she was spending on these courses. "How was your day?" Barry asked, trying to stay calm. "Oh, it was great. My coach said I'm one of the best. He said I have quick thinking and absorb material really well, Caitlin replied with a smile, her eyes glued to the screen. I'm really proud of my progress. Barry heard her words and felt his heart start to pound. Who was this coach telling her she was the best? It sounded overly flattering, especially since she was paying such huge sums for the training. Of course, they'd tell her she was the best. Even more troubling was that she never explained how much these courses cost, as if it were completely normal. That's great, Caitlin, Barry said, trying to keep as much emotion out of his voice as possible. But maybe we should take a closer look at how much we're spending on these courses. Caitlin paused for a moment. She set the laptop aside and looked at him. What do you mean? She asked, her tone less pleasant than before. I just think you're spending a lot on these courses, Barry replied calmly. It's more than I expected. Caitlin shook her head, her expression growing distant. Barry, this is important for my career. I've told you, I'm working on myself. This is what I want to do, and I need these courses to succeed. You don't want me to stay just a housewife forever, do you? Barry felt the heavy silence fill the room. He couldn't understand why she reacted so aggressively to his question. And what exactly was Caitlin hiding? At that moment, Barry decided he wouldn't bring this up with Caitlin directly anymore. He wanted to understand why she had changed so much and what was really going on. He decided to quietly observe her actions. A few days later, Barry decided to call one of Caitlin's coaches, hoping to get some answers. He found the number online and called, introducing himself as a curious partner. Hi, this is Barry, Caitlin's husband, he said when the coach picked up. I wanted to learn a bit more about these courses. I've heard she's doing really well, and I'm curious about how she fits into your program. The coach chuckled on the other end of the line. Oh, Caitlin is one of the best. She picks up the material quickly, has an incredible ability to learn. She's a real talent. I think she has huge potential. She's not just a participant. She's becoming a leader among others. Barry felt his heart tighten. This was too much. What was going on? What did leader mean in this context? What did the coach mean when he said she was the best? And why was he so openly praising her without any hesitation? He decided he wouldn't intervene further, but his suspicions grew. He resolved to learn more about her courses without Caitlin suspecting he was investigating. Barry sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen. His fingers automatically typed out lines for the book he had been working on for days, a story about his relationship with Caitlin. He described his wife as gentle, beautiful, and kind. She had always been his support, his universe. Barry tried to calm himself with these words, to ease his suspicions, even though Caitlin's recent actions had been truly unusual. But now, she seemed more and more indifferent to him. She often went to training sessions in person, and even when they were online, her moods and emotions shifted. She became less available, paid less attention to the house, and seemed to think only about her career. But the worst part was that she spent more and more time with unfamiliar men, businessmen who also attended these expensive courses. Barry tried to ignore it, but the more he thought about her new acquaintances, the more anxious he felt. If only he could understand what was really happening. He decided not to ask Caitlin uncomfortable questions, as he didn't want to appear suspicious, but his intuition told him something wasn't right. That evening, after Barry returned home from work, he heard laughter coming from the kitchen, echoing through the house. When he walked closer, he saw Caitlin sitting at the table with two people, a man and a woman. They were discussing training sessions, but the conversation seemed far too lively, almost too casual to be just about work. Oh, it was such an amazing training session. And those exercises are just thrilling, Caitlin said enthusiastically, looking at the man. Barry, though trying to stay calm, couldn't help but notice how she touched his hand as she spoke. Barry stopped on the stairs, watching them from below. He noticed that Caitlin looked very relaxed and cheerful, and the man, his name was Bruce, with whom she had been talking, seemed far too close to her. Barry heard Bruce laugh. I never thought training sessions could be this interesting. And honestly, Caitlin, I can see how much you're changing. You're definitely a leader among us. Caitlin laughed and poured herself a glass of wine. It was a small detail, but Barry noticed she was already on her second glass for the evening. Her behavior seemed more carefree, almost flirtatious. I'm so glad you all enjoyed it, Caitlin said, glancing at Barry over her shoulder. "Oh, this is my husband, Barry. We've been together for a long time." Barry walked over to them, forcing himself to appear relaxed, though inside, his heart was on fire. "Hi," he said, trying to smile. "How's your evening?" The man on the other side of the table stood up, smiling warmly. "Great. Caitlin and I were just discussing how these training sessions truly change our approach to life," he replied. "You know, I'm glad we're all part of the same circle." Barry felt an invisible tension in the room become increasingly apparent. His gaze left no doubt. Caitlin was significantly more at ease and engrossed in her conversation with this man than with him. He felt like an outsider, as if he didn't belong in this picture. "Excuse me, I'll go prepare dinner," Barry said, trying to remove himself from the situation without moving closer to Caitlin. Caitlin looked at him, and her eyes were not as warm as they used to be. "Oh no, don't worry about it, Barry. We can handle everything ourselves," she said, pausing briefly and noticeably increasing the distance between them. "I've decided that my friends and I will take care of everything tonight. You don't mind, do you? Or maybe we'll just order something to eat." Barry tried to keep himself together, but those words pierced him like a knife. She wasn't the same as before, and it was obvious. He heard her words, but his heart refused to believe them. What happened to the Caitlin who used to look forward to dinner with him and evening conversations? Now, he was no longer her priority. Barry retreated to the kitchen, feeling completely out of place. He realized that none of this was accidental. What if these training sessions and her new acquaintances were just a cover for something much bigger? What if she was no longer interested in anything but new connections and entertainment? He couldn't, and didn't want to, believe what his heart was telling him. Barry continued to act as if he noticed nothing, so he could surprise her later when he uncovered the whole truth. But none of this was accidental. Barry stood in the kitchen, watching Caitlin and Bruce stand close together, laughing and exchanging private jokes. They seemed so connected that he felt an uncomfortable sense of being unnecessary. Bruce, a middle-aged businessman with a perfectly tailored suit and a confident demeanor, acted as if he were at home. He spoke about his business ventures, barely paying any attention to Barry, and continued enthusiastically discussing the new opportunities these training sessions offered. Barry tried to remain calm, but the more he listened, the tighter his chest felt. Caitlin, meanwhile, stood next to him, her gaze fixed on Bruce. She didn't even notice when Barry stepped away. Her face lit up with excitement, and when Bruce accidentally touched her hand, she didn't pull back. On the contrary, her eyes sparkled with curiosity. The same Bruce she had mentioned so often lately now seemed to be the center of her universe. Barry couldn't stand it any longer and decided to step forward. He approached them, trying to appear casual. "Hi, Bruce. I've heard you're involved in some big business. That sounds impressive," he said, attempting to steer the conversation toward a more formal tone. Bruce smiled, glanced at Barry, then turned back to Caitlin and whispered something in her ear. Barry noticed how Caitlin flinched slightly at his words and immediately laughed. It wasn't a natural laugh, but more like an acknowledgement, a shared understanding between her and Bruce. "Oh, I'm involved in a few ventures, mostly in real estate and investments. But as you can see, this training opens up new opportunities. I've already found some very promising partners here," Bruce said, looking at Barry with an expression that seemed to evaluate him. "Caitlin is one of the most promising participants in this course. She has great potential, and I'm confident that after completing the program, she'll make an excellent partner in my business." Barry felt as though he had just been pushed aside, his presence rendered irrelevant. He tried to remain polite, even though inside, he felt this was just the beginning of something much bigger. He saw how Caitlin and Bruce exchanged glances, their smiles growing increasingly intimate. Barry couldn't understand why Caitlin had changed so much. She had always been so kind and attentive to him, but now her eyes didn't even see him. Barbara, Caitlin's new friend, was also there. She appeared to be an influential figure in the business world, always talking about new opportunities and connections. Barry felt his nerves beginning to fray. Caitlin was no longer the woman he knew. She didn't come over to him, didn't hug him, didn't support him. All her thoughts were with Bruce and Barbara. "Caitlin, don't you want to go for a walk?" Barry tried once more to get her attention, but she didn't even turn her head to answer. "Not now, Barry," Caitlin said without looking at him. "Bruce and I were just discussing a potential business collaboration. It's really important for us. We'll talk later." Barry felt his heart tighten. She was there, but so far away. All these training sessions, acquaintances, and new people. It was as if she had become a different person. Barry felt that her interests had shifted, and he was no longer her priority. Bruce and Barbara had become more important. Barry decided to keep calm. But that night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened to his wife. What was she searching for in these training sessions, in these new people? And why was she no longer seeking his attention? In bed, Caitlin stayed awake for a long time, and Bruce constantly ran through her thoughts. She felt captivated by his words, dreaming about a future with him. Barry was only a part of her past, but Bruce was her future. Barry lay in bed, straining to hear every sound in the darkness. Caitlin sometimes struggled to fall asleep late at night, but this time something felt different. He heard the faint rustle of the blanket and, a few moments later, saw her quietly get up and dress. Throwing off the blanket, Caitlin slowly left the room, trying not to wake him. Barry couldn't believe his eyes. He didn't know what had made her get up so late, but something told him this wasn't just a nighttime stroll. He quietly got out of bed and followed her, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. Caitlin didn't turn on the light, and her steps seemed cautious. She made her way to the balcony, and Barry heard her open the door. He approached the window and saw her standing on the balcony, speaking on the phone. Barry couldn't hear exactly what she was saying, but it was clear that she didn't want to be overheard. Her voice was muffled, as if she was deliberately trying to keep the conversation private. Something about her behavior unsettled Barry. Why was she being so cautious? Who was she talking to? He stood quietly, trying to piece together what was happening. But, unfortunately, he couldn't catch a single word. Caitlin ended the call and seemed completely unaware that her husband had been watching her from the window. The next morning, Barry gathered his thoughts, trying to make sense of what had happened during the night. He sat at his desk and began writing in his book about his relationship with Caitlin. Barry continued writing about how she was drifting away from him and the suspicions he had about her. He was beginning to believe she might be cheating on him. Now, he felt alienated. He watched her gradually pull away from him, and it left him restless. What had happened to their connection? Instead of directly addressing what he had noticed with Caitlin, he decided to learn more. When Caitlin prepared breakfast, Barry thought it would be a good moment to casually ask her about her partnership with Bruce. "So, what did you and Bruce agree on?" he began, trying to sound calm. Caitlin looked up, her eyes tired but still carrying a spark. She smiled and sat across from Barry. "Oh, he's offering me an amazing position," she said enthusiastically, as if the news was something exciting and important. "He wants me to become the CEO of his company. It's a huge opportunity. I'm so glad I was noticed. I worked so hard for this during the training sessions." Barry felt his heart skip a beat. CEO? That's a big role, even for someone with experience. How did this happen so quickly? He fixed his gaze on Caitlin, trying not to reveal his doubts. "But how did that happen? I mean, it's such a big company. Are you really ready for something like that?" he asked, trying to sound innocent, though he was deeply worried. Caitlin smiled again, and it was the same smile that had once captivated Barry. She looked confident and happy, her eyes shining with pride. "I know it's a huge responsibility, but Bruce believes in me. He said I'm the best person for the role. I never imagined I'd be working in such a high position at such a big company, but now it feels real, and I think this is my chance. I really love that I can realize my potential." Barry tried to smile, but something inside him was setting off alarms. She was climbing to such a big position so quickly? He thought back to all the hours she spent absorbed in her training sessions and how often she had been away from home. He couldn't help but wonder if there was more to this. What if Bruce was just manipulating her? "You've done great, Caitlin. You've always known what you wanted and worked hard to achieve it," Barry said, though his words sounded less confident than he'd hoped. "I hope it all works out. I'm sure you'll do great." Caitlin threw her head back and laughed, as though she didn't notice how her words had hurt Barry. Her laugh was warm and genuine, But Barry felt the distance between them growing again. She was different, and he couldn't understand why. But what had happened the night before, when she had quietly talked on the phone, continued to gnaw at him. That day, Barry continued writing his book, but this time his reflections took a different turn. He began paying attention to every detail in their relationship, and each of Caitlin's actions raised new questions in his mind. He wrote down his suspicions, with each chapter feeling like the pain was sinking deeper into his soul. And he knew that eventually, he would uncover the truth, even if it hurt. Barry felt his heart tighten every time he looked at Caitlin. She was drifting further and further away, and it was evident not just in her behavior but in how she treated him. She was no longer the same woman he had once loved and admired. Instead of spending time together, she was increasingly consumed by her training sessions, new acquaintances, and of course, Bruce. He tried to convince himself it was just paranoia, but the more time passed, the more he felt that something was wrong. One morning, Barry sat at the table, trying to calm his thoughts, when Caitlin walked into the kitchen. She was wearing a bright dress, and his eyes lingered on her elegant appearance. He couldn't help but notice how she subtly tucked her phone into her bag when she saw him. "You look beautiful today," Barry said, trying to sound attentive, though his voice carried a hint of tension. "Thank you," Caitlin replied, smiling, but her smile was cold and distant. "Are you going somewhere?" he asked, observing her closely. "Oh, yes, I'm heading to a training session," she replied without meeting his gaze. "There will be some important meetings. I need to be prepared for anything." Barry heard her words, but once again, he felt like something was being left unsaid. He continued watching her as she quickly packed her bag and prepared to leave. He couldn't help but notice how nervous she seemed, and it made him feel even more uneasy. "Caitlin, why don't you stop for a moment to talk to me?" he asked, trying to understand what was going on. She lifted her head and looked at him, but her gaze was firm and cold. "I have a lot to do, Barry. We'll talk later, okay?" she replied, giving him no room for further questions. At that moment, Barry felt that this wasn't just convenience or a lack of time. Caitlin was changing right before his eyes. And though she tried to show that everything was fine, Barry couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger and deeper was behind her behavior. The day passed in thought. Barry tried to return to his writing, but his mind kept drifting back to Caitlin. He felt that her change was tied to something specific, and he couldn't understand why she had become so distant. When Caitlin returned that evening, she looked tired but happy, as if she had accomplished something important. She greeted Barry and immediately began talking about how well her training session had gone. "It was amazing," she said with excitement. "I met so many interesting people, and Bruce said we'll be signing the contract soon." Barry looked at her, and his heart sank. Bruce again. "And what's this contract about?" he asked, trying to stay calm. "Oh, it's just formalities," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "But I'm really happy that Bruce and I agreed on the partnership. It's a big step for my career." Barry felt a familiar, uneasy feeling return. Why hadn't Caitlin mentioned this contract before? And why was she discussing everything so quickly with Bruce as if it were just routine? "I'm happy for you," Barry said, trying to sound supportive, though his voice was filled with doubt. "It's a big opportunity." He couldn't say more because he realized this matter required more serious thought. Why wasn't Caitlin being honest with him? Why had everything become so strange? That evening, as they sat together at the table for dinner, Barry felt the distance between them growing. Caitlin looked at her phone more than she looked at him, barely paying him any attention. She was consumed by her thoughts and plans, which only deepened his anxiety. "Caitlin, can we talk?" he asked, unable to hold back anymore. "Of course," she replied, though her voice lacked the warmth Barry once felt. He took a deep breath and began. "You've changed, Caitlin. You're not the same person I married. I can't ignore this anymore. You're always busy, distant, and I'm starting to feel like there's something you don't want to tell me. What's going on?" Caitlin looked at him with quiet surprise, as if he'd said something unexpected. "Barry, you're just overthinking," she said, turning her gaze away again. "Everything is fine. I'm just changing. It's normal. But why are you spending so much time with Bruce? Why has this partnership become so important to you?" he asked, unable to hide his suspicions any longer. Caitlin fell silent. She didn't respond, and that silence was worse for Barry than any words. He waited for her explanation, but all he heard was a quiet sigh. Barry could no longer ignore his suspicions. With each passing day, he became more convinced that something was going on between Caitlin and Bruce. He couldn't understand why she was becoming so distant, why her gaze was filled with mystery. His heart raced every time he thought about how Caitlin acted around him, especially around Bruce. The next day, Barry decided he couldn't just sit and wait for the truth to reveal itself. He decided to follow Caitlin. So, when she left for another training session in the morning, he quietly left the house and got into his car. He followed her through multiple turns, making sure not to arouse suspicion. Caitlin didn't notice him. She drove the same route she always did, as if nothing unusual was happening. Barry knew where she was headed, but now he wanted to know who she spent her time with and if there was anyone else besides him. Caitlin stopped at a cafe, and Barry couldn't miss Bruce waiting for her. He looked confident and even slightly arrogant, and their meeting appeared very close. Bruce hugged Caitlin, and then they walked into the cafe together. Barry couldn't take it anymore. He parked his car at a distance, but stayed to observe. He didn't want to be too obvious, but his heart was pounding, and his nerves were starting to fray. He watched as they sat at a table, laughing and discussing things in a tone Barry had never heard Caitlin use with him. Bruce talked about some business plans, and Caitlin listened attentively, almost captivated by his words. Barry couldn't watch any longer. He returned to his car and drove back home. His head was spinning with thoughts about what he had just seen. Caitlin was clearly engrossed in her new venture, and Bruce seemed to be at the center of her attention. Barry increasingly felt that his wife was changing, but he still couldn't bring himself to believe that infidelity was what she was hiding from him. That evening, when Caitlin returned home, Barry tried to remain calm. "Did you have a good time?" he asked as she walked into the room. "Yes, very productive," Caitlin replied, taking off her coat and avoiding his gaze. "Bruce showed me a lot of interesting ideas for the upcoming project." Barry couldn't hold back anymore. He asked her directly, "Caitlin, what are you really doing with Bruce? You've been spending so much time together. Is this just business?" Caitlin froze for a moment and then quickly replied, "It's just work, Barry. Are you starting to get jealous?" "I'm not jealous. I just want to know the truth," he said, watching her reaction. "The truth? I'm just focusing on my career, and you don't support me. You don't even understand how many opportunities this is creating for my future," she said, sounding defensive. Barry felt his heart tighten. She changed the subject again, refusing to give him a clear answer. "Caitlin, you've changed. This isn't just business anymore," he said, trying to stay calm, though anger was beginning to take over. "Maybe I have changed," she replied, though her voice was less confident than usual. "But that doesn't mean I don't love you." Barry sighed and decided he needed to keep following her. He couldn't continue living in uncertainty. A few days later, Barry watched Caitlin again. He didn't let on that he knew more than she thought, but that day, he saw something that pushed him toward a final decision. Caitlin met with Bruce again, and this time they were even closer. She was already sitting on his lap, their gazes meeting with such romantic warmth that Barry realized this wasn't just business. He couldn't take it anymore. That same day, he found out where Bruce lived and decided to go there. His heart pounded faster as he approached the place. He had only one goal: to find out the whole truth. When Barry arrived at Bruce's house, he saw them through the window. Bruce and Caitlin were embracing. That moment was decisive. Filled with anger and heartbreak, Barry realized that his wife was no longer the person he remembered. Barry couldn't bear it any longer. He couldn't hide his pain and suspicions anymore. Following Caitlin and Bruce had led him to this place, Bruce's house. Barry's heart pounded in his chest, but he decided to act. He had to know the truth. He crept up to the window and saw Caitlin and Bruce standing in the middle of the room. Their faces were close, and he saw their lips meet in a kiss. Time seemed to stop. Barry felt cold sweat break out on his forehead. He couldn't believe his eyes, but what he saw was undeniable. His wife, his beloved Caitlin, was cheating on him right now, and Bruce was not just a business partner. He was the man she had chosen. Barry climbed the steps to Bruce's door. He was ready for anything but didn't truly know what he hoped to achieve. Caitlin had just betrayed him, and now he had to confront the truth. He opened the door and walked into the house without knocking, not waiting for an invitation. The room was dimly lit, with only the streetlights outside illuminating Caitlin and Bruce's faces. They noticed Barry immediately, and their expressions turned to shock. They didn't even have time to try to hide their embarrassment. "Barry!" Caitlin exclaimed, her voice filled with panic. She quickly pulled away from Bruce, as if trying to justify her actions, but Barry already knew what he had seen. "Caitlin, I saw it," he said with cold disappointment in his voice. "I saw you kissing him. I saw how you act around each other. Is it true? Did you cheat on me with him?" Caitlin froze. She couldn't find the words. Her eyes filled with tears, but Barry was no longer ready to sympathize. All he felt was anger and the pain of what had happened. "Barry, I don't know how to explain this," she said, struggling to find the words, but her voice sounded increasingly hesitant. "Do you still want to explain?" Barry asked. "How can you explain this? You're cheating on me right now, and you still want to tell me this is some kind of accident?" At that moment, Bruce stood up from his chair and raised his hands, as if to show he wasn't afraid of confrontation. His gaze was cold and calm, which only infuriated Barry more. "I'll explain everything," Bruce said, his voice confident. "There's no point in hiding it anymore. I used her, Barry. Everything you see here, it's not what Caitlin thinks. I'm not giving her any position in my business. It was all just a game to me. You see how much she wants to be in the spotlight, right? Did you really think I'd just hand over such a high position? Of course not. I just wanted to spend time with her. I liked her, but I'm not interested in long-term relationships." Barry couldn't believe what he was hearing. He stared at Bruce, and his heart sank. He couldn't accept these words, but everything Bruce said seemed plausible. "You used her?" Barry whispered, unable to believe this was really happening. "You just wanted her? All this, the business, it's just a cover for your game?" "Exactly," Bruce replied, smiling briefly. "You have no idea how hard she tries to sell herself, how much she thinks she's capable of everything. She wants to be a businesswoman, but she doesn't realize it's all just a facade. I'm only with her because I wanted her, not because I was ever going to offer her a position in my company." Caitlin stood in silence, her face flushed with shame, unable to say anything. Her eyes revealed how hard it was for her to face the truth, but she no longer had the strength to convince Barry otherwise. You just wanted to break me?" Caitlin asked, her voice trembling with disappointment. "Was this all just a game to you?" "Yes," Bruce replied, his voice cold and merciless. "You became a piece in my game, Caitlin, and I'm not going to give you what you want." Barry listened, feeling his heart break into pieces. Everything he believed in, everything he loved, had been destroyed. Caitlin, the woman he once adored, had betrayed him, and Bruce had simply used her as a pawn in his game. "I don't know how to go on living with this," Barry said, realizing that all these years had been a lie. "You destroyed everything, Caitlin. And you, Bruce, you're just a cruel man." Caitlin couldn't hold back her tears. She lowered her head, seemingly realizing that she had lost everything: Barry, her dignity, and the future that once seemed so promising. Barry couldn't figure out how to cope with all the pain. His heart was shattered by the betrayal, but he couldn't just walk away from Caitlin. She was a part of his life, and even if he couldn't forgive her, something deeper remained. A need to express his truth and, at the same time, find a way out of this trap. So, he decided to do what he couldn't have done at any other time. He decided to write a book. Barry was a writer, and the pain of betrayal transformed into creativity. He wrote through the nights, diving deeper and deeper into his thoughts. He described every moment, every instance when Caitlin had promised him one thing but did something completely different. He recounted his doubts, his attempts to understand her, and the cracks in their relationship that had begun to form even before he knew the truth. But the hardest part was writing about the moment when trust wasn't just broken, it was obliterated. Every time he thought of Caitlin, his mind was overtaken by thoughts of revenge. How could he just let it go when his pride and self-respect had been so deeply wounded? And so, in a moment of clarity, he made a decision. He wrote the final chapter of his book, the one that would recount the hardest and most painful moment of their relationship, the moment he realized she had betrayed him. The book was finished, and Barry felt a sense of relief. All his emotions, all his pain, all his suspicions, doubts, and heartbreak were poured into its pages. Now, there was only one thing left to do: give the book to Caitlin. One evening, when Caitlin returned home, Barry was waiting for her, sitting on the couch with the book in his hands. She walked into the room, and seeing him, tried to smile, but the smile was strained, and Barry immediately noticed her nervousness. "Hi," Caitlin said, taking off her coat. "What are you doing?" Barry lifted the book and held it out to her. She looked at it, but said nothing. "This is for you," he said, not lifting his eyes from the pages. He handed her the book, and Caitlin, though unsure of what was happening, took it. "What is this?" she asked, opening to the first page. Barry leaned back against the couch and began to speak. "This is our story. Everything that happened between us. All your promises, all your words, and most importantly, your betrayal. You didn't just destroy our love. You destroyed your own life. And now, you can read how it all looked from my perspective." Caitlin froze, her eyes fixated on the pages, but Barry's words were undeniable. "Barry, I don't know what to say." Her voice was soft, but she was clearly uncomfortable. "I can't believe this. This is your truth, but not mine." Barry sighed heavily, looked at her, and replied, "You have your truth, Caitlin, but now you'll have to face mine. And I can't let this go without consequences. I can't just let you walk away when you've destroyed what we had." Caitlin lowered her head, feeling ashamed, and looked back at the book. Meanwhile, Barry watched her with cold determination in his eyes. "Do you know why I did this?" he asked, his voice slightly softer but still firm. "I don't want to live in a world where this goes unpunished, where you just walk away like nothing happened. I understand that you can't forgive me, Barry, but it's not how you think," she said, lifting her head to meet his eyes. "I've shamed myself, and I've shamed us both. I know you don't want to hear this, but I'm asking for forgiveness." Barry looked at her again, his eyes softening. He didn't know what to feel. Was he ready to forgive her? Was it even worth trying to rebuild what had already been lost? His heart was filled with pain, but he understood one thing. He couldn't live without doing this, without expressing everything he felt, without giving her this book, which had become his final goodbye. "You've disgraced not only yourself but me as well," Barry said. "You destroyed everything we had. But now you have a chance to understand why it mattered to me. This book is my way of telling you. I won't forget this." He stood up from the couch and walked to the door. The last thing he heard from Caitlin was her quiet voice, trying to stop him. "Barry, please, don't go." But he didn't turn back. The book remained on the table, the final testament to his pain, his decision, and his ultimate choice. What would you do if your partner gave you a book describing how they experienced your betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments.